He left me exactly $0 on my tip line after running me ragged for an hour. But what he left under his plate was far more dangerous than a few crumpled bills. It was a cream-colored note with a time, an address, and a single line that felt like a cold blade against my throat. And when his security guard called me by a name I hadn't used in 20 years, I knew my life as a simple waitress was over. I was a 33-year-old woman working at a greasy spoon in Galveston, drowning in my family's debts, but by the end of that week, I would be the one holding the keys to a multi-billion-dollar empire while my own flesh and blood begged for mercy. Was I wrong to burn it all down to find the truth, or would you have done the exact same thing if you found out your entire life was a lie designed to keep you a slave to people who never loved you? Tell me, would you keep a secret that could destroy your family if it was the only way to save yourself? My name is Brooklyn Rivera, and for most of my life, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was the daughter of Wade and Darla Rivera, the owners of the Gulf View Grill, a boxy little diner perched on the edge of the Texas coast where the humidity is so thick you can practically wear it. The air in that place was a permanent mix of frying catfish and stale pancake syrup, and the rhythm of my life was set by the clicking of the overhead fans and the ringing of the order bell. I wasn't just an employee. I was the engine that kept the place running. I started working there when I was 15, and at 33, I was still there, scrubbing the same griddles and smiling at the same local regulars who never tipped more than 10%. My parents always preached that family comes first, but in our house, family first was code for Brooklyn pays for everything. If the walk-in freezer died, it was my savings that fixed it. If the property taxes were overdue, my tip jar was emptied into the register. I lived in a converted garage behind the main house, a cramped space that smelled like salt and old wood, and I worked 6 days a week for a paycheck that usually dissolved into the restaurant's operating costs before I could even see the ink. I was trapped in a loop of guilt, convinced that if I ever left, my parents would go under, and their blood would be on my hands. Every morning started at 4:30 a.m., dragging my exhausted body to the kitchen to prep the industrial-sized vats of coleslaw and tartar sauce. I watched my youth slip away in the steam of the dishwasher, my hands becoming calloused and scarred from years of handling scalding plates and sharp knives. My best friend Sarah, who worked as a 911 dispatcher and was immune to everyone's nonsense, told me constantly that I wasn't in a family, I was in a hostage situation. She would sit at the counter during her lunch break, watching Wade lounge in his office while I covered 6 tables at once, and she'd whisper that I was rowing a sinking boat for people who wouldn't even throw me a life vest. But I couldn't see the exit until the day the black SUV rolled into the gravel parking lot, and the world I thought I knew began to splinter at the seams. It was a Tuesday in mid-July, the kind of heat that makes the pavement shimmer like water and makes everyone's temper run short. The diner was packed with sunburned tourists and screaming kids, and the air conditioner was making a sound like a dying animal when the room suddenly went quiet. It wasn't a natural silence. It was the kind of hush that happens when something powerful enters a space. Outside, 3 identical black SUVs had pulled up, and 4 men in dark suits stepped out, looking like they belonged in a government motorcade rather than a fish fry joint. They scanned the rooflines and the parking lot with the clinical efficiency of Secret Service agents before one of them opened the back door for a man who looked like he had stepped out of a different century. He was older, with silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than our entire building, and he walked into the Gulf View Grill like he owned the ground it sat on. My father, Wade, practically tripped over himself to get to the door, his eyes wide with the frantic greed of a man who smells a big tip. He shoved me toward table 12, the best seat in the house overlooking the water, and whispered that this was a whale, the kind of customer who could pay our electric bill with one gesture. I took a deep breath, smoothed my apron, and walked over to the man who would change everything. He introduced himself as Graham Whitlock. He didn't look at the menu. He just asked for a glass of iced tea with exactly 2 slices of lemon and sat there watching me. Not the ocean, not his phone, he watched me. Every time I passed his table, I felt his eyes on the back of my neck, analyzing the way I moved, the way I spoke to other customers, and even the way I winced when my back started to ache. He stayed for nearly 2 hours, picking at a plate of shrimp and watching the chaos of the diner around him, like he was studying an ant farm. The tension was suffocating. Wade kept poking his head out of the kitchen, gesturing for me to work the table. But Graham didn't want conversation. He wanted silence. When he finally asked for the check, my father was hovering by the kitchen door, practically salivating. I brought the bill, $24.50, and Graham Whitlock handed me $100 bill, telling me to keep the change for the house, but to look under his plate after he left. I thought it was a creepy proposition at first, or maybe a hidden $100 bill, but when he walked out and those SUV roared away, leaving a cloud of dust, I lifted the plate and found nothing but a blank tip line on the credit card slip he had also signed. He had taken his change back in cash from my father at the register. On the table was just a cream-colored business card with no name, only an address in Houston and a time, 8:00 p.m. tonight. Beneath it, scrawled in elegant, sharp handwriting, were the words, "They are lying about the fire, Brooklyn. Come find out why." My heart stopped, and the air in the diner felt like it had been sucked out of the room. The fire. When I was 6 years old, our family home had burned to the ground. My parents told me I was lucky to be alive, that they had lost everything: photos, birth certificates, memories, and that we had to start over from nothing. It was the foundation of our family's us against the world mentality. They used that fire to justify every hardship, every penny they took from me, and every dream I had to give up. How did this stranger know about a fire from 27 years ago? And how did he know my name when I wasn't wearing a name tag? I tucked the note into my pocket, my mind racing with a mixture of fear and a strange, bubbling curiosity. When I told my parents a man had left a weird note, their faces didn't show curiosity. They showed pure, unadulterated terror. My father's face went pale, a sickly shade of gray I'd never seen before, and my mother dropped a stack of ceramic plates that shattered across the linoleum like ice. They immediately started shouting, their voices overlapping in a desperate attempt to drown out my questions. They told me it was a scam, a prank, or a crazy person from the city, and that I was strictly forbidden from going to Houston. They threatened to fire me, to kick me out of the garage, to disown me if I even thought about following that address. Their overreaction was the loudest confession I'd ever heard. For years, I had accepted their word as law, but that night, for the first time in my life, I lied to them. I told them I was going to Sarah's house to sleep off a headache, but instead, I got into my rusted sedan and drove toward the gleaming lights of the Houston skyline, the business card burning a hole in my pocket. I arrived at a massive glass skyscraper that housed Whitlock Industries. The security guard at the desk didn't ask for my ID. He just looked at me with a knowing, almost pitying expression and said, "Good evening, Miss Rivera. Mr. Whitlock is expecting you on the penthouse floor." The elevator ride felt like it took a lifetime, the numbers climbing higher as my stomach dropped lower. When the doors opened, I found Graham Whitlock sitting in a library that looked out over the entire city, surrounded by walls of leather-bound books and expensive art. He didn't waste time with small talk. He handed me a folder filled with old newspaper clippings, architectural blueprints, and high-resolution photographs. He told me that he was my uncle, the brother of a man named Julian Whitlock, who had been a rising star in the tech world decades ago. He told me that my parents, Wade and Darla, weren't my parents at all. They were the former domestic staff, the gardener and the housekeeper of the Whitlock estate. The fire wasn't an accident caused by a faulty heater, as I'd been told. It was a deliberate cover-up. According to Graham, my real parents had died in that fire, trapped in their bedroom, and Wade and Darla had rescued me from the nursery, only to disappear into the night with a massive insurance payout and a kidnapped heiress to ensure their silence and their future. They hadn't saved me, they had stolen me. They had raised me as a servant in their own home, using my guilt and my sense of duty to keep their secrets buried under layers of fish fry and floor wax. I sat there, the world spinning, looking at a photo of a woman who had my eyes and my smile, standing next to a man with Graham's nose. My real mother and father. They looked happy, wealthy, and full of life, everything I was not. Graham explained that he had spent 20 years searching for me, following a trail of breadcrumbs that finally led to a small diner in Galveston. So that's the situation I was in. My entire identity was a fabrication. My parents were actually my kidnappers who had murdered my inheritance and my childhood, and I was sitting in a penthouse across from a man who claimed to be the only family I had left. Before I tell you what I did next and how I took my revenge, I want you to pause and comment below. What would you do? Would you go back to the diner and confront them? Or would you take the money and run? Would you call the police immediately? Or would you play the long game to see just how deep the betrayal went? I need to know if I was the only one who felt this level of cold, calculating rage. I didn't call the police that night, despite the urge to scream until my lungs gave out. I realized that if I went to the authorities now, Wade and Darla would vanish. They had been running for 27 years. They were experts at hiding in plain sight and turning into ghosts the moment they felt the heat. I needed them to think they were still in control. I needed them to believe I was still the same obedient, guilt-ridden girl they had groomed me to be. I went back to Galveston, back to the garage, and back to the diner the next morning at the usual time. It was the hardest acting performance of my life. I watched Wade bark orders at the busboy, his face red with false authority, and saw Darla complain about the price of eggs while wearing a necklace I now realized had probably belonged to my real mother. All I could see were the monsters who had stolen me from a nursery and watched me sweat for them for 2 decades. Every "I love you, honey" from Darla felt like a physical blow. Every "we're in this together" from Wade felt like a mockery of the truth. Graham had given me a plan and a team of lawyers who were already working in the shadows. He revealed that while Wade and Darla had stolen the initial cash, they hadn't been able to touch the primary trusts. Because of the way the original Whitlock estate was structured, I was the legal majority shareholder of the subsidiary that owned the land the Gulfview Grill sat on, along with several other properties in the area. Wade and Darla had been paying rent to a shell company for years, never realizing that the shell company was part of the very empire they had stolen me from. They were paying me to live on my own land, and they didn't even know it. I waited until the following Monday, the day the mortgage and the property taxes were due, the day they were always the most stressed and the most vulnerable. I walked into the diner's cramped back office where Wade was nursing a beer, and Darla was counting the weekend's cash, their fingers stained with the grime of other people's money. I didn't bring them coffee this time. I brought them a thick, legal folder bound in blue leather. When Wade saw the Whitlock Industries logo on the front, he tried to snatch it, his eyes flaring with that same terror I'd seen when I first mentioned the note. I held it back, my grip firm. I told them I knew everything. I told them about the fire, about Julian and Eleanor Whitlock, and about the fact that they were never my parents. The transformation was horrifying to witness. They didn't cry, they didn't apologize, and they didn't even try to deny it once they saw the DNA results. They turned vicious. Wade slammed his fist on the desk and told me I was an ungrateful brat, that they had saved me from a life of cold, heartless luxury, and given me a real home with real people. Darla screamed that I owed them for every meal I'd ever eaten, every pair of shoes they'd bought me, and every roof they'd put over my head. She actually had the audacity to claim that kidnapping me was an act of charity because my real family was too busy for me. They truly believed their own lies. That was when I delivered the final blow, the one that would strip the ground from beneath their feet. I informed them that as the majority shareholder of the property and the CEO-elect of the holding company, I was terminating their lease effective immediately. I had already filed an injunction to freeze all the restaurant's bank accounts that were mostly filled with my stolen tips and unpaid labor. I told them they had 1 hour to pack their personal belongings and leave. The confrontation moved to a public courtroom 3 days later, and it was a media circus. My parents hired a bottom-tier lawyer who tried to argue that they were my psychological parents, and that Graham Whitlock was a billionaire predator trying to buy A daughter he never knew to improve his public image, but Graham was prepared. He had more than just DNA. He had the original employment records, medical files that showed I had been treated for smoke inhalation days after the accident, and a secret witness that Wade never expected to see again, the retired fire marshal who had been paid off 27 years ago to call the fire an accident. The man was dying of cancer and wanted to clear his conscience before he met his maker. He testified in detail about how Wade had approached him with a bag of cash to ignore the accelerant found in the master bedroom. As the evidence mounted, Wade and Darla's family first facade crumbled in front of the entire world. They started turning on each other in the middle of the hearing, right there in the front row. Wade started screaming that it was Darla's idea to take the girl because she couldn't have her own, and Darla shrieked that Wade was the one who spilled the gasoline. It was the most pathetic display of human cowardice I had ever seen. The judge didn't just rule in my favor regarding the property. She ordered an immediate criminal investigation into kidnapping, arson, and grand larceny. I watched the bailiffs move in, the metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the silent courtroom. They didn't look like my parents anymore. They looked like small, bitter, shriveled people who had built a kingdom out of grease and stolen lives. After the trial, I drove back to Galveston one last time. The Gulfview Grill was officially closed, the "For Sale" sign hanging crookedly in the window, its paint peeling in the salt air. I unlocked the door with my old key and walked into the silence. The smell of grease was still there, but it felt stagnant, like a memory that had gone rotten. I sat at table 12, in the same seat where Graham had sat, and looked out at the Gulf of Mexico as the sun began to set, turning the water into a sheet of liquid gold. I was now a very wealthy woman, the head of a legacy I was still learning to understand, but for the first time in 33 years, I felt like I actually belonged to myself. I realized that the strength I used to survive those years of backbreaking labor and emotional manipulation was the same strength I would use to build something meaningful. I didn't stay in the diner business. I sold the land to a coastal conservation group to ensure that no one would ever have to sweat in that kitchen again, and the building was slated for demolition to make way for a public park. I kept the cream-colored note in my wallet as a reminder that the truth doesn't always come with a tip, but it always comes with a price. Wade and Darla are currently serving 15 years each in a federal facility, and I haven't visited them once. Some things are unforgivable, and stealing a child's entire existence is at the top of that list. I'm finally living for myself, and for the first time, the air doesn't smell like salt and desperation. It smells like a fresh start. This experience taught me that family isn't about blood, and it certainly isn't about obligation or the debts people claim you owe them. It's about the people who see you for who you really are, who protect your light instead of trying to extinguish it, and who would never ask you to set yourself on fire just to keep them warm. If you're in a situation where family feels like a prison, or if you feel like you're carrying the weight of people who wouldn't do the same for you, remember that you have the right to walk out that door and find your own truth. You don't owe anyone your life just because they claim they gave it to you. Like this video if you think I did the right thing by putting my kidnappers behind bars and taking back what was mine. And subscribe for more stories of people taking back their lives from the shadows. Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Do you think 15 years is enough for what they did, or should they have gotten life? I'll be reading every single one of your responses. I'll see you all in the next story. Would you like me to find another story for you?